In this video, we're going to talk about different types of relationships between organisms. These relationships are all under the category of symbiosis. You might have learned this in middle school, but make sure you go through the whole video and take notes. Make sure if there are questions, you write down the answers to the questions in your notes so that you know all the correct terminology that we're going to be using in this class. So to start out, we need a definition for symbiosis. Symbiosis is a close and permanent relationship between two organisms. Close meaning they have to interact directly with each other, and permanent meaning it can't be a one-time thing. Symbiosis means things are living together. So things are in the same ecosystem interacting all the time. There are three kinds of symbiosis we're going to talk about in this video. We're going to talk about mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. Then we're going to end up talking about predation, which again should be reviewed from middle school, but if you don't quite understand it, make sure you write down questions. The first type of symbiosis we're going to talk about is something called mutualism. So mutual in general, which is the root of the word, means something that you share. So mutualism is a symbiotic relationship in which both species are going to benefit. So it's good for both things. Typically, if you struggle memorizing word definitions, I would just memorize that it's a plus-plus type of relationship, meaning good for one thing and good for the other. So I give the example of you have this big fish and then you look down and there's this little fish floating by its mouth. Okay? That little fish actually is going to go inside the mouth of this bigger fish and help clean its teeth. So the big fish is going to be benefiting because it's getting its teeth cleaned. And you might not realize this with brushing your teeth, but that actually prevents you from getting infections or bacteria built up in your mouth. And if you didn't do that, it could actually make you really sick. So basically the little fish is helping the big fish stay healthy. And even though it's really gross to think about, the little fish is benefiting because that bacteria inside the big fish's mouth is actually the food for the little fish. So the little fish gets food and the big fish gets cleaned, and that's why it's considered positive for both. Good for the big fish, good for the little fish. That's mutualism. So another example is between coral reefs and algae. So you might not realize this, but coral reef is actually a living thing. And in coral reefs in the ocean, algae actually lives on top of it. So algae is all this green plants over here. And how do they both benefit? Well, algae actually, through photosynthesis, can make enough food for itself and give off food to the coral reef. So the coral reef is getting food supplied constantly by the algae, and the algae attaches itself onto the coral reef, and instead of having to float through the ocean and have no place to basically live, by attaching on, it actually provides shelter for the algae. So the algae gets shelter from the coral reef, and the coral reef gets food from the algae. So they're both benefiting. That's a plus relationship, which is how we think of mutualism. One more example could be lichen. So lichen are made up of, so lichen is, if you've ever seen this stuff on trees, lichen is actually a mutualistic relationship between fungi and algae, and they actually have a similar relationship to coral and algae. So algae, again, can make food, and the fungi can actually protect the algae from other things. So they're both benefiting. Again, this is a plus for the fungi and a plus for the algae. So the next type of symbiotic relationship is known as commensalism. I refer to this as a plus and then zero relationship. And the reason for that is because mutualism had two things benefiting. Commensalism is a symbiotic relationship in which one species benefits, so something good happens to one species, and the other species isn't hurt, but it also doesn't get anything good. So in the example on the left, it shows a picture of Spanish moss. So Spanish moss grows on trees. And the moss benefits because in a forest, if you live at the bottom of the forest, you're shaded, and you don't get as much sunlight, so you can't do as much photosynthesis. So by the moss growing on the trees, it has more access to sunlight and is benefiting. In the case of Spanish moss doesn't overgrow on the trees, and so it's not going to hurt the trees in any way. So it's not like a vine that might choke a tree or a really invasive moss. It just grows a little bit. So it's not hurting the tree, but at the same time, it doesn't help it. It's not giving it food. The tree makes its own food. It's not giving it protection. The tree is not being covered and protected by the moss. So we say it neither is harmed nor benefited, and that's commensalism, which is a little bit more difficult to understand. So we'll use another example of commensalism that maybe, if you've ever seen Finding Nemo, you're a little bit more aware of. And that would be the clownfish and the sea anemone. So in the case of clownfish, a lot of times they live in these things called sea anemones. And an anemone is just a sea animal that is poisonous if you don't have a certain chemical that covers your body. And so in this case, the clownfish is going to benefit because if it can live inside the sea anemone, it gets this basically fortress or a house that's protected on the outside. It can hide from enemies, it can hide from predators, and it's safe within the sea anemone. But in this case, it's not a situation where the clownfish then does anything for the sea anemone. It doesn't hurt it by living in it. It's completely unaffected, but it also doesn't help it. So we call that commensalism because while the clownfish is benefiting, put a plus on the clownfish, nothing is really happening to the sea anemone. The last type of symbiotic relationship is called parasitism. So if you've ever heard of a parasite, you think of that as a bad thing. And so in a parasitic relationship, we have this good for one thing, bad for something else relationship. Some interactions are harmful to one species and then benefit another, and that's the definition of parasitism, if it hurts one thing but helps another. An important feature about parasites is that typically parasites don't want to kill you right away. So we're going to talk about predation later, and that's pretty much immediate death, right? If something's your predator, it's going to kill you and then eat you. In the case of parasites, though, it's going to harm you, so hurt you, but not kill you right away. It's going to slowly kill you because parasites need their host in order to survive. So if you are a parasite, you have to live basically inside your host or live off of your host. And as soon as your host dies, you either die or you have to move on. So it's not really beneficial for them to kill you right away, but they are going to hurt you. So I give the example of a tapeworm. Tapeworms are parasites, and they attach onto your intestines and basically suck all the food out of you. And in the case of a tapeworm, they're going to eat all your nutrients, so your small intestine, which we'll learn later is part of your digestive system. And all your nutrients, before they get absorbed, are going to travel to your small intestine. And in the case of tapeworms, they attach onto your small intestine, and the way that they harm you is by basically starving you to death, so taking all of your food. So fun fact, just because science is so fun, one way that scientists have actually found you can get rid of a tapeworm is to starve yourself. Because if they no longer are getting food from you, then there's no longer a benefit for them to stay inside you. And then what you have to do is if you take really potent, so really strong smelling meat that's raw and put it in front of your mouth, if you've starved yourself for long enough, the tapeworm will actually climb out through your digestive system and out of your mouth, because if it's starving inside your body, it's not good for it to stay in there, and once it smells the flesh of the meat, it actually will climb towards it. And so if the tapeworm is small enough, it will climb out of your digestive system onto this piece of meat if you want to get rid of it. In humans, it's really common, so these are other parasites, it's really common for parasites to go to your digestive tract, so that's where your food goes from. And the reason for that is because a really common way for them to hurt their host is by taking their nutrients. So maybe a parasite doesn't have its own way of digesting food, so it relies on humans or other animals to get food. So other parasites might grab onto your digestive tract, or this one on the left is called a lungworm. And basically this is lung tissue over here. and what it's getting from its host is both nutrients from the blood that's going to circle through your lungs and oxygen. So it also, in the case of this parasite, doesn't have its own way to get oxygen nor its own way to get food. And the last parasite I'm going to show you is called the guinea worm. And basically, the guinea worm gets under people's skin. It feeds off the host. So in the case of the guinea worm, which you can see if you look closely here and down here, it's hurting the host, it's hurting the person that lives inside, but it is growing bigger and stronger the longer it stays inside. So now we move away from symbiosis. So symbiosis were those three things: mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism. And we're going to talk about predation in the same video because it's still an interaction between two species. Predation is when one species, and we kind of already covered this, but a predator, eats all or part of another species, which is known as the prey. So in this picture to the right, it's pretty easy to see that the snake is the predator and the frog is going to be our prey in this case. It is getting eaten. So if you didn't know those words before, that's what it means. Predator, thing eating the thing, prey, what's getting eaten. So predation is found in all ecosystems and includes organisms that eat plants and animals. So, for instance, it is still considered technically predation when a primary consumer eats a plant. The last thing we're going to talk about in this video, and again, it might be something that's a review for you, is called competition. The two words that might be new are interspecific and intraspecific. So if it's inter, it means two or more species compete for the same resource. In this case, in the case of inter, think international. You're not staying within a country if you're international, you're going between countries. So in the case of interspecific competition, you have two different species, or you could have more than two species, but you have to have at least two species competing for the same thing. They might compete for resources if they both have the same food. They might compete for habitat if they both live in the same area and rely on the same types of habitat. But interspecific means competition between, let's say, a lion and a hyena. The other type, intraspecific, is within the same species. So two gazelle competing over a mate, two lions competing over certain resources or habitat. During mating season, it might be particularly high to have intraspecific competition, again, because in order to get a good mate, you have to have resources. You have to have a lot of habitat. And so species, particularly its males, are going to have intraspecific competition. At this point, you should understand the three types of symbiosis, predation, and competition. If you didn't catch any of that, make sure you rewatch the video and pause it. But now we're going to move on to some check yourself questions. The first check yourself question is a multiple choice that you've seen before. So which of the following organisms compete for the mouse as a food source? Now you should have a context for what compete means. You can disregard these letters and instead use A, B, C, and D. Now look more about mutualism, commensalism, and parasitism for questions 2 and 3. Make sure if you don't understand these, you either make a little mark in your notes or go back and rewatch the video. Now try to apply what we learned with food webs and this new information about types of relationships for question 4. Now we went over number 1 in class a little while ago, but we'll go over 2, 3, and 4, and if you didn't get these answers, you need to make sure you go back and watch the video. So question 2 says, many lichen are composed of fungi and algae. The fungi get sugar from the algae, and the algae gets water, minerals, protein from the fungi. Which of the following terms best describes the relationship between organisms? Because I'm a math type person, I like to use the plus and minuses. So I would start by looking at the fungi. In the case of the fungi, they're getting sugar from the algae. So for me, I see that as a good thing. In the case of the algae, they're getting minerals, water, and proteins. So again, if you're getting stuff that's good for you, I see that as a good thing. And the plus model was mutualism, so you'd say the answer is C. Looking at question 3, which of the following is an example of mutualism? A lion eats a gazelle. Well, that's good for the lion, bad for the gazelle. That's predation. So we get rid of A. A virus uses both a bird and a horse as hosts. So the virus is benefiting, that's plus. But the bird and the horse, remember, host means it's taking nutrients from you. That's a bad thing. And again, plus minus is parasitism. So it's definitely not B. Then we go to C. A bacterium breaks down dead plant minerals. Well, if a bacterium is breaking stuff down, it's going to be good for the bacteria, but maybe indifferent for the dead plant material. Nothing's really benefiting. You could either argue this is predation because the bacteria is eating something. We'll learn later that that's decomposition. Or you could say commensalism, but it's definitely not mutualism, which is plus. So then we just verify that D could be right. Bird eats food particles from a crocodile's teeth. Well, the bird benefits, it's getting food. Crocodile's teeth are getting cleaned, so we pick D. To do question 4, it says, which of the following describes the relationship between the sedge and the Arctic hare? Now, even if you don't know what these things are, you should be able to figure out the relationship. In order for something to be competition, two things have to be fighting over one thing. So, for instance, are the hare and sedge both fighting over something? Well, because there's no arrow going into the sedge, you can conclude that this is a plant of some kind. And therefore, are plants and rabbits, which is the same thing as a hare, ever really fighting over something? Probably not. Get rid of competition. In the case of parasitism, is that Arctic hare going to slowly harm the sedge? Probably not, because we learned from food webs that this arrow means the Arctic hare is just eating the sedge, and that's not parasitism. Again, you can get rid of mutualism because, yes, the sedge is going to be eaten by the Arctic hare, so the Arctic hare is benefiting, but kind of the sedge is, by getting eaten, being harmed. So we get rid of mutualism because that's a plus-plus relationship, and we can figure out its predation. So again, remember, if something's getting eaten by something else, that's our definition for predation. If we did want to try to figure out an example on this problem where we had some competition, what we could easily do would be to look at this food web, and we could say, okay, what's a food source that they're both going to be benefiting from? Let's say we circle grass. Who competes over grass? Well, the Arctic hare and lemon both eat grass. That's what this arrow signifies. So you could say they compete over grass. So if this question were, which of the following describes the relationship between the Arctic hare and lemming, then the answer would actually be A, they're competing. If you don't understand questions 1 through 4, or you didn't get the competition way of figuring things out in a food web, make sure you rewatch this video. Otherwise, make sure you do the practice worksheet that goes along with it.